Peace, peace, peace. Welcome to another episode of Wise the Dome TV. Today I have a very special guest. Definitely a friend of the show, intellectual, author, professor, author of this new book, Jacob Carruthers and the Restoration of an African Worldview. Everybody get that. The link is in the description. It's an amazing work, and we are definitely going to get into it now. And so again, brother Kamau Rashid, thank you for coming through.
For sure. Thank you for having me. Very glad to be here. Very glad to talk about this work and the ideas of Dr. Carruthers.
Absolutely. And so before we even go there, what kind of inspired you or led you on the path to create this work?
That's a good question. So when I was in grad school, no, so I went, I suppose my connection to Dr. Carruthers' work perhaps begins in the 90s when I was an undergrad at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign.
Hmm.
I was in a bookstore. I'm pretty sure it was the old Afrocentric bookstore. It was downtown in Chicago. Chicago folks gonna remember this.
Hmm.
Down on like I think it was Jackson and Wabash, right under the L, right under the L tracks. And I believe it was there in the summer of '94. I bought a copy of Essays in Ancient Egyptian Studies. This is it, right? This is the one I
Hmm.
bought. I'm pretty sure I got it from there that summer. And back then in the '90s, that's really when I got into the habit of collecting books, right?
Hmm.
Not because I'm gonna read it now, but because I want it when I'm gonna read it in the future.
Hmm.
But it would be at the end of the '90s and the very beginning of the 2000s that I would find myself being a graduate student at Northeastern Illinois University, where Jacob H. Carruthers was a professor. Interestingly enough, my first semester there, I would take one class with him.
Hmm.
I think one
Awesome.
class with Dr. Anderson Thompson. And
Wow.
it wasn't like I planned this. I
Yeah.
was already conscious, a nationalist, a cultural nationalist, a Pan-Africanist. But it was really quite through happenstance that I found myself there. And once I was there, and once I was in those classes with him and Dr. Thompson, I knew I was in the place that I was supposed to be in. And after that, I went to grad school at the University of Illinois, back to Champaign, essentially.
Hmm.
And It was in the spring of pretty sure it was the spring of 2004. I was writing a paper for a class. We had to write a paper. We had several assignments, but one of the assignments is you had to write a critical analysis of a text that deals with issues of education. I think it was education in class.
Hmm.
And then you're supposed to write a juxtaposition of the ideas of two scholars relative to their text. And I think the first paper I want to say was about miseducation of the Negro. So the
Hmm.
paper was really about education in class, but I'm concerned about the condition of Black folks. And
Right.
so, just
Right.
some liberties. So, though there is a class dimension in Woodson's analysis, to be sure, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so that initial paper was about Carter G. Woodson's Miseducation of the Negro. The second paper, however, was a paper where I'm looking at Dr. Carruthers and Dr. Woodson's ideas. That paper I ended up publishing not a few years later in the Western Journal of Black Studies, and that paper is also chapter one of the book.
Hmm. Hmm.
So for me, once I wrote that initial paper and once I had published it, I kind of, it was something that I did. I wasn't really of a mind of continuing to write, about Dr. Carruthers and his ideas. But once I returned to Chicago in the late 2000s, I found that I was constantly presented with opportunities to explore his ideas.
Hmm.
Whether it was the annual Carruthers Conference, which, the Jacob H. Carruthers Conference, which is an event that the Kemetic Institute of Chicago does, or whether it was the Association with the Study of Classical African Civilizations, either the Midwest Regional or the International Conference, or even just local events.
Hmm.
I constantly found people asking me to address topics for which Dr. Carruthers' ideas I thought were appropriate. And it was in the process of really writing and continually writing about his ideas that I ended up accumulating a body of work. So I want to say like in 2011, I think it was, I published another article. It was a piece on his educational thought. That was chapter two in the book.
Yes.
And I want to say it was another one in 2014. I published another little chapter, relatively short essay, which is chapter, I think it's chapter. is one of these chapters. Number three in the book.
Hmm.
And at any rate, it was at that point that I realized I'm like, I'm obviously writing a book. I can't,
Right.
man,
Right.
let me just fully commit. And it was at
Hmm.
that point that I began to map out what this project might look like in its totality,
Hmm.
and that set about the business of getting it done. But for me, really, the idea was to. My concern is this: when we look at those people who are committed to the suppression of African people, those people continually build on the ideas of their ancestors,
Absolutely.
find those ideas,
Hmm.
no matter how injurious those ideas may be to us
Hmm.
or the earth. They
Hmm.
can see the mind, the thought, and the practices and the values and the worldview of their ancestors for the sake of finding additional ways to maintain their power in the world. Conversely, if we are determined to be free, we have to mind the ideas of those African thinkers who have been intentional and clear about the need for us to liberate ourselves. And so to me, just like Ptah says, that everyone teaches as he acts. For
Hmm.
me, it's important for us to model the importance of engaging deeply and meaningfully with the ideas of African thinkers for the sake of demonstrating how they provide models whereby we can orient ourselves in the struggle for freedom. And so for me, it was important to do this because we have to do this work rather than treating the work of our thinkers as things which have their greatest significance, their greatest import in the past, in the periods in which they existed. We
Hmm.
have to understand these ideas in the ways in which they contribute to informing our ongoing efforts to liberate ourselves. And I would argue that Dr. Carruthers, from all of his works, the totality of his works, has a great deal more to teach us about the nature of the reality, as he would say, how to extricate ourselves from the mess that African people are in.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I was had a conversation online the other day, and I think the brother was being a little bit facetious whenever I was I think I'm not sure which institution I was calling out at the moment, but he was like, well, what's your solution? And I had to let him know. I said, when you're in the movement and you ask questions like that,
Mhm.
that kind of lets me know you're not dealing with any intellectual frameworks that we have created and evolved within the Black liberation or Black radical tradition, because the solutions lie with what the people that came before us already put down, and we're just here to further them. And
Right.
so, and that's what we're kind of going to get into now. Before we kind of even go into some of Jacob Carruthers' ideas and views on having an African worldview, I think it's important to kind of at least, even if it's briefly, talk about the Kemetic Institute and
Mhm.
ASCAC as well, because obviously these are institutions that um, are responsible for not only teaching the community, but becoming a place where people of African people of that are interested in moving our intellectual traditions forward can
Mhm.
meet, build relationships,
Yeah.
and collaborate on things. And so obviously I obviously know much more about ASCAC than I do the Kemetic Institute.
Mhm.
But if you can you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, yeah, and I'll say that for Dr. Carruthers, one of the things that's very apparent in his work, and when I'm referring to his work, I'm referring to at least three spaces, and I write about this in the introduction to the text. His work as a scholar, his work as an educator, and then his work as an institution builder,
Hmm.
right? Work are those things in their totality. And this is also a sebayet, that is an instruction.
Hmm.
Sebayet, a Kemetic word of the root is the word seba, which is a teacher but and so this Sebayet is instruction, and he one of the instructions or one of the Sebayet that he demonstrated in his life is the critical importance of institutions. So the Kemetic Institute of Chicago was founded in the late 1970s as a vehicle to engage in the critical analysis of ancient African history. Particularly the history of Kemet. The reason this mattered to Dr. Carruthers, and this is very interesting because one of the things he talks about how his intellectual trajectory was shifted as a result of his encounter with Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop.
Hmm.
Um, I think it was Dr. Clark, wrote a letter of introduction to him for him, and he went to Senegal. and met with Dr. Job. And Dr. Job at that point impressed upon him the imperative of studying the history and culture of ancient Kemet. And this had profound implications for Dr. Carruthers' thought. And I think many people, particularly many Eurocentric oriented Black intellectuals, don't understand why for Job or for Dr. Carruthers or for many of the intellectuals around them, why the study of Kemet mattered. Well, one of the things that Dr. Carruthers is concerned about is our temporal orientations, that is, our conceptions of time and also correspondingly space. Uh, he argued that if we fail to transform our conceptualization of who African people are in the past, then we fail to transform our capacity to conceive of a future beyond the
Mm,
fetters of European domination. So the Kemetic Institute was founded in the late 1970s as a means to facilitate research and study pertaining to Kemet, but also education for the community. And this is a mission that we've carried forward to today. So over the decades, we've done a number of things from publishing books and journals to doing trips to Kemet in the past, to doing we used to do a series called Teaching About Africa, which was a program to educate teachers, to equip teachers to teach about Africa, particularly from an African-centered vantage point in their classrooms. One of the programs that we continue to do today is the African. It's a film series that we do in the fall where we
mhm,
view films pertaining to the African world and engage in critical conversations about them. We do community education classes where we deal with a whole range of topics from the study of Medu Neter, that is the language of ancient Kemet, to African, or specifically Kemetic literature and Kemetic history and so forth. And so the organization, in the past, youth programs, and I talk about some of that in the introduction, but essentially the Kemetic Institute was founded as an organization focused on the education of African people around an African-centered paradigm and the critical interrogation and reconstruction of our paths so that it could serve as a means whereby we effectively liberate ourselves. The Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations comes later. I should say between those two, actually, you have another organization that formed, the Temple of the African Community of
mm,
Chicago. This is an organization that Dr. Carruthers founded also for the sake of promoting African spirituality. One of the things that was a core concern of his is that African spirituality, he argued, was key in terms of reorienting how we see ourselves, how we see the world in its totality, because, we all know for spirituality, spiritual practices are constitutive of ways of living and being.
mhm.
And so one of the arguments which he advanced is that in order for us to commit ourselves to ways and living and being which are, one, grounded in the ways and the paradigms of our ancestors, but also two, inextricably linked to our efforts to free ourselves, then we have to develop our own, we have to develop or engage in spiritual practice rooted in Africa. And then finally, the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilization. This organization, comes along in the mid 1980s. 1984 was the Egyptian Studies Conference, out of which comes the founding of ASCAC. The organization at its founding, I mean, there were a host of really major African-centered scholars that were engaged. In addition to Dr. Carruthers, you have Dr. John Henrik Clarke, Dr. Yosef Ben Yakanan, Dr. Maulana Karenga, and others throughout the course of ASCAC. Of course, scholars like Dr. Theophilo Benga would be engaged. They took the purpose of ASCAC was essentially, as it says in many of the ASCAC texts, the rescue and reconstruction of African culture.
Mhm.
Again, building on this idea that was inherent in Dr. Carruthers' work, as well as the work of other African-centered thinkers like Dr. John Henrik Clarke and Dr. John G. Jackson and others, that our conception of the past is inextricably linked to how we understand ourselves in the present, as well as our notions of futurity. So the past was not, that study of history was not just about gaining a deeper understanding of the past, though it was concerned about such a thing, but it was also concerned with our ability to imagine a future
Yeah.
possibility beyond the fetters of, again, European domination. And so ASCAC committed itself to not only the study of African history and culture, but also the dissemination of such knowledges in the community via organizing, via our annual conferences and various regional conferences, via study tours to Kemet, via study groups, and so on. And I'm happy to say that ASCAC has continued that work all the way to the present moment. Doctors Mario Beatty and Greg Kamathi Carr have, they've been taking for the most, last several years, trips to Kemet,
Hmm.
many, dozens and dozens and dozens of folks to Kemet, connecting them to this heart of ancient African civilization. Of course, the our annual conferences. One of the things that's been interesting is because of COVID, everything went virtual,
Yeah.
and our conferences were no different. And it
Hmm.
was interesting that doing them in a virtual format really did meaningfully it great impact in our ability to just engage with the African world.
Mm.
And so that
Hmm.
has been really invigorating. And of course, our study group process, and
Right.
all the regions maintain, study group process. I'm in the process right now of us attempting to, in the Midwest region, there are various local study groups. I'm actually in the process now of establishing a Midwest region study group for folks who are in cities where there aren't a lot of ASCAC members. But
Hmm.
again, the purpose of ASCAC is again to give our people a deep sense of who we are, a deep sense of our past. And ASCAC's research, as well as education initiatives, are centered around several commissions: research, spirituality, creative production, and education. And part of the idea is to both study, engage in research pertaining to those areas of knowledge, but also to disseminate information to our people in each of those domains as a way, again, giving us tools that we can use to reorient ourselves in time and space.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the title of the book, Jacob H. Carruthers and the Restoration of an African Worldview. You explain in the book how one's worldview is one's worldview shapes their reality, right? And not only that it shapes their reality, it can shape public policy, it can shape a plethora of different things, right, in regards to our daily lives and our future. Um, and so obviously the antithesis of that would be a European worldview, which of our many of our people may be caught up in that web and not really understand it. Not, even well-intentioned people can be
Mhm.
caught up in that, and you go through that as well. And so you speak about Carter G. Woodson and miseducation of the Negro and his ideas of some of the academic elite, or who Du Bois would have called the talented tenth at that time, oriented in a um, Eurocentric worldview, right? Which limited their capacity to liberate us or further our liberation movements, or help to liberate us mentally from this Eurocentric worldview that's enslaving our mind. You also spoke about de-education
Mhm, mhm,
uh, that Jacob Carruthers wrote about, and obviously menticide, and I feel like it all relates, right?
mhm. Yeah.
Um, and so, if you can just speak about how one's worldview
Mhm.
does shape our reality, how it can shape public policy, how it can shape who how we're treated in our daily lives from a personal and a systemic level.
Yeah, yeah. Worldview is critically important. I would argue that for Dr. Carruthers and for other African-centered thinkers, he regarded worldview as the fundamental basis which is key in orienting us, as the fundamental basis upon which we orient ourselves in reality. Um, One of the things he's keen to do this, he does this, he writes about this in an essay, Too Much Schooling. No, 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 it's in the book Too Much Schooling, Too Little Education, edited by Mwalimu Shuja. The essay is Black Intellectuals on the Crisis in Black Education. And in
Mhm.
this, and he does this elsewhere, such as in his book Intellectual Warfare. But at any rate, in this essay, he talks about worldview, and he talks about how worldview, unlike this idea, many intellectuals talk about ideology,
Mhm.
right? And you see this, of course, see this in academia, of course, as social media users, we're inundated with various ideological discourses and the types of premises which issue forth from them. Uh, Dr. Carruthers, however, argued that one of the challenges with regards to this concept of ideology is that ideology was often equated to concepts of social class, particularly coming out of the Marxian tradition of thinking about certain ideological orientations or this being byproducts of a type of class consciousness or lack thereof. For him, worldview pertain to simply how one sees the world,
Hmm.
apart from any kind of class connotation.
Hmm.
Uh, the important thing is this, right? Dr. Carruthers, in much of his work, though he's writing from an African-centered vantage point, though he's engaged in this attempt to reclaim key aspects of the African paradigm, he's drawing upon, as he says in his book Medu Neter, he's drawing from the deep well of African thought,
Hmm.
right? So if we were to hop in a time machine and to go back in time, like 1,200 years, right? And we were to go to some Igbo community in what is today southeastern Nigeria, and we were to observe their system of governance, these are people who, again, have yet to encounter Christianity.
Hmm.
So maybe they've encountered Islam, but Islam is really a little ways to the north. Uh, Certainly they've encountered, and even just whatever encounters they've had with folks who are outside of their cultural sphere, they're anchored in a sense of who they are, their
Yes.
traditions, their practices, their beliefs, their social organization, and so forth. And so their way of seeing reality and the types of social organization that issues forth from it in its totality would be their worldview. For him, this concept of worldview was a attempt to conceptualize the operationalization of that. The thing is that liberated people, free people, that is, people who are not dealing with the contestation of their paradigms in relation to adversarial others, don't have to think about this. They don't have to delineate what their worldview is in contrast to the worldview of someone else, right? Because their worldview is ascendant. Their worldview is the established, institutionalized, uncontested norm.
Right.
But in the context of oppression, in the context of cultural hegemony, one has to indeed delineate one's worldview. And so for him, again, and this is also why the study of Kemet was so important.
Hmm.
Because when you look at Kemet, you see this explication of a particular way of seeing the universe, a way of seeing people's interrelations with one another, people's relations with the divine, people's relations with other societies, people's relations with nature, and on and on and on. And so for him, this concept of worldview is a foundational basis in terms of how we understand the nature of reality itself.
Yeah.
One of the things that he argued was key to the Eurasian worldview was this idea of fundamental alienation. And he writes about this certainly in Medu Neter, Divine Speech. And it also comes up, of course, in intellectual warfare. But this idea of fundamental alienation was let me say it like this. I was introduced to this idea not through his writings. My initial encounter, it was in a class with him. It was tricontinental antiquity. What is it? History or
Hmm.
history of literature, tricontinental antiquity. I think it's literature, tricontinental antiquity. I think is the name of the course. This is back in the early 2000s,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Grad at NEIU, Northeastern Illinois University. And in the class, we read literature from ancient Kemet. We read literature from ancient Greece. We read literature from ancient Mesopotamia. And one of the things that was interesting when you read these texts is that there was a distinct difference in terms of how each of these cultures represented itself
Hmm.
in terms of the relationship, like interhuman relationships between humans, relationships between humanity and nature, relationships between humanity and the divine. And what you saw, of course, in these texts from Western Asia and Southern Europe was an adversarial
Yeah.
relationship,
Man
right?
versus nature.
Exactly. Man
Hmm.
versus nature, man versus man. The divine is selfish and capricious, and so
Hmm.
man versus the divine and the divine versus the divine, right?
Right.
Gods versus the gods. This is in contrast to the way the relatively harmonious way in which the Kemetiu, that is the people of ancient Kemet, saw themselves and saw the world around them. And what, of course, Dr. Carruthers talks about again in Medu Neter Divine Speech is that this way of seeing reality was not just present in Kemet, but we find relative continuity with regards to this notion in later African societies. And so for him, the worldview is important because this represents the fundamental basis upon which we see reality. And the reason this matters among is I argue it matters in a myriad of ways, but I'll just give two basic examples.
Hmm.
One, we are engaged in a struggle against people who have a worldview which is predicated on fundamental alienation. And one of the things that I write about in the book is that as a consequence of that worldview, their culture and their institutions reproduce conditions of alienation in every sphere of social activity. So if you have a worldview that's predicated on the idea of innate conflict, that is, conflict and contestation is the basic nature of reality, one will then reproduce that in one's interpersonal relations, in one's political institutions,
Hmm.
in economic systems, in one's
Hmm.
system of governance, in one's systems of resource distribution, in one's religious traditions, and so on and so forth. That is, the idea of fundamental alienation is reflected in everything. And so, on one hand, we're struggling against the people whose paradigms, whose very way of seeing the universe is fundamentally distinct, not only from that of our ancestors, but I would also argue fundamentally antithetical to the type of social arrangements which would produce which would produce optimal outcomes for African people.
Hmm.
Secondly, many of our people, bereft of a center, bereft of an African center in which to anchor themselves, are also subject to these ideas, and therefore they begin to interpret reality in ways
Hmm.
reflecting fundamental alienation, right? And so for us, it becomes things like, male versus female, or this particular black ethnic group versus that particular black
Hmm.
ethnic group, or this particular oppressed people versus that particular oppressed people. Again, it becomes for us, for whatever reason, it becomes a discourse, and it becomes really a fetishization of atomization is really the
Yeah.
best way to think of it. It's a fetishization of subdivision,
Mm.
and with the desire to reduce us to the most meaningless
Yeah.
uh, meaningless aggregate of humanity, as if any of these ideas have the capacity to free us in any meaningful sense. And I should say, when I'm talking about this idea of freedom for Dr. Carruthers, is not sufficient for us to free ourselves simply on the basis of social arrangements, that is, simply in political terms,
Right.
right? That we can't be truly free if our minds are fettered, right? As
Mm.
Dr. Wilson would say, we can't be free if our
Hmm.
minds are fettered by people who control how we think, how we perceive reality.
Hmm. I also see this adversarial European worldview come up in conversations about capitalism that I have a lot, because what the person ends up saying is humans are just naturally selfish.
That's right.
Humans are
That's
just
right.
naturally greedy. And I'm
Yep.
like, that's interesting that you would say that, right? Because again, whose worldview and what lens are you looking at
Mhm.
humanity through?
That's right.
And and so again, this whole I think that's one of the reasons why this book, obviously, Dr. Jacob Carruthers and the people that you mentioned, such as Harold Cruz and who wrote uh, Rebellion and Revolution and uh, Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, and then E. Franklin Frazier with Black Bourgeoisie and
Hmm.
all of the Carter G. Woodson and all of these, and Jacob Carruthers, all of these people who began to diagnose what is wrong with our brain. You know what I'm saying? Like, not necessarily what is wrong with our brain, but what is wrong with what has been done to our brain that caused us
Right.
to think the way that we are thinking.
Mhm.
And so I really appreciate just you highlighting these things, because I think it's important. One thing that I noticed in a lot of discourse happening around Kemet lately is, it seems like, I'll take it back a little bit. Like, whenever I first started getting knowledge itself and would hang out at the local black bookstore when I was in high school, you would see a lot of books on ancient Kemet, right?
Mhm.
Even intuitively, we would pick them up, even if we didn't know why. It was just something innate within us. We would pick it up. Again, like you said, we may not read it as soon as we get it, but a couple of months down the line, maybe a year or two,
Yeah.
it's there whenever we need it. But um, now it seems like the discourse on Kemet has kind of gone off track for a lot of different reasons, reasons that we don't even have to get into at the moment. But why, whenever we are talking about our re-Africanization or reconceptualization of African concepts and our epistemologies and ontology itself, why is, for us in our community,
Mhm.
why has Kemet, for the most part, always been our point of entry?
Yeah. Yeah. That's an excellent question. You know, I think, the interesting Kemet, I don't think I mentioned it in the text. I know I remember Dr. Mario Beatty mentioning this in a presentation that he did at
Hmm.
ASCAP years ago, probably a decade ago now. No. It was I think it was at the Wilhelm Meta conference that we did in Chicago back in 2017. He talked about Martin Delany and how
Hmm.
Martin Delany, really the father, we said the father of Black nationalism.
Hmm.
Uh, Martin Delany took an interest in Kemet, and in fact began to study Metal Nature. You know, this raises a very interesting question. Why Kemet? And this is something that I've thought a lot about in terms of the vectors of historical memory,
Hmm.
right? And by that I mean the 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 elements which contribute to how particular people see and conceptualize their past are often linked to things which are extant in their social milieu, right? Uh, like if you look at, for instance, Afro-Brazilians, in many ways, the vectors of historical memory for Afro-Brazilians inevitably directs them to the Yoruba,
Hmm.
uh, the Congo, and other and Angola and so-called Bantu peoples. If you think about Haiti, again, in many respects, the vectors of cultural memory in Haiti often connects back to the Fon, the Ewe, certainly the Congo as well. These vectors of cultural memory are the elements that exist within a cultural context that orients people towards a particular way of conceiving the past. I think for Africans, and I think so. My point is that I think in order to understand the interest that emerges in Kemet, we have to understand the context of the 19th century.
Hmm.
Um, you have and not only the context of the 19th century, but also the 19th century in America, but also the context of African enslavement in the United States. I think for thinkers like Martin Delany and others who in the 19th century began to commit themselves to conceiving of a future of African people, Delany had the intelligence to recognize that no people can conceive of a future for themselves absent a reconciliation with their past,
Hmm.
right? He was clear about this. And perhaps his clarity about this stemmed from the way in which uh, Europeans, especially, attempt to argue that their foundation, their cultural foundation is Greco-Roman antiquity. Perhaps
Yeah,
this was the impetus.
I can see
Um,
that.
yeah, or maybe it was simply the Ethiopianism, and I have a feeling that this may have been the greater of those influences, the
Hmm.
Ethiopianist elements in Black political thought at the time. For those who aren't familiar, Ethiopianism is a Dr. Anderson Thompson used to refer to it as a type of proto-Pan-Africanism,
Hmm.
right? It was this philosophy that was based on this verse in the Bible that Egypt shall send forth princes and Ethiopia shall stretch forth a hand to the
Yeah,
people.
yeah.
And for many of these African thinkers in the 19th century, this was a prophetic statement.
Hmm.
This is a prophetic statement. Ethiopia became symbolic, became a signifier not of the state, of Ethiopia itself, but of the African world.
Yeah,
Right?
absolutely.
And Egypt, of course, representing, the standard bearer,
Hmm.
right, as it were, of African civilization. And so for a people that are attempting to, particularly in terms of the way Martin Delany, because Martin Delany, people have to understand, Martin Delany was a nationalist.
Hmm.
Martin Delany was not simply a theorist, but he is concerned about how African people will free themselves, how African people will establish a political and economic basis for their future.
Right.
Uh, Such things he argued necessarily had to be actualized or concretized on the basis of concrete ideas and concrete institutions. And so for him, I think these Ethiopianist ideas probably had a big impact in terms of orienting him to look at Kemet. That is,
Hmm.
what is the thing which is the basis of African civilization, this thing which we are attempting to realign ourselves with today. That is, in establishing an independent state for African people, which is really what Delaney was working
Right.
towards. What conceptual and historical basis do we anchor that thing with? Where does it sit within this continuity of African historicity, right?
Hmm.
And so I think that may have been a part of it. To be sure, however, the orientation towards the study of Kemet persists. right? And so when you get to the 20th century, we find many of the major Black thinkers, certainly people like W.B. Du Bois, uh, William Leo Hansberry, and so many others that are looking at Kemet, that are attempting to understand the significance of Kemet to understanding African people's past. And so the I think Kemet continue for them again in the 19th century into the early 20th century. I think Kemet was significant because they saw it as an exemplar.
Yeah.
They saw it as an exemplar. I think by the time we get to the 1950s, and Dr. Clark spoke to this, I believe he spoke to this in Great and Mighty Walk, unless I'm misremembering. Uh, when you get to the mid 20th century and you have the emergence of Sheikh Anta Diop,
Mm.
you know, this was really Sheikh Anta Diop represented a truly path-breaking. He represented truly path-breaking developments in terms of the reclamation of African historical consciousness.
Right.
Um, that we aren't simply, that for us in the diaspora, that our history doesn't simply begin when some boat stopped and dropped us off here, right? So I was actually talking about this earlier today, that in history month, a lot of time, nothing goes before, no, nothing is discussed past the year 1619, before the year 1619, nor is our history uh, limited even to the different, African ethnic groups from which we derive.
Right.
But our history goes further back, and one of the things that Sheikh Anta Diop demonstrates is this continuity between various groups in West and West Central Africa and Central Africa and the Nile Valley in terms of language, in terms of cultural traditions. And so Diop contributes to a fundamental broadening in our conceptualization of African historicity. And I think for thinkers like Carruthers and many others, therefore, Kemet becomes not simply an ideal element of our past, but a constituent element in terms of how we understand the type of cultural derivation which has occurred among African people from antiquity to the present.
Hmm.
And so Kemet then, therefore, comes to represent really a fundamental element in terms of how we conceive of ourselves and our movement through time and space. The last thing I should say, because there's some people who have a very pejorative view of the study of Kemet.
Yes.
I'm talking about Black people. I'm not talking
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
African.
I already know. Hmm.
I've seen many people who would argue that the study of Kemet is somehow compensatory, right? That because of a deficit of historical accomplishment that you have, that African people are seizing upon Kemet. I've seen other people who they made statements to the effect that you have Africans who are bypassing the study of their West and West Central Africa
Hmm.
in order to study Kemet.
I see that a lot.
Yeah, yeah, and I
That
think that
argument, at least. I mean.
exactly, yeah,
Mhm.
and again, I think this is all based on a fundamental misapprehension of the nature of the past. Again, we're talking about cultures which are inextricably linked. We're talking about and Cheikh Anta Diop, Theophile Obenga, and other African descendant scholars, and many of the African descendant scholars who write in French have written about this as well. We're
Hmm.
talking about a Kemet in many ways represents a matrix of African cultures,
Hmm.
a matrix of African civilization. Uh, and and therein, the study of Kemet is, again, as I said before, is about understanding the continuity of African ideas from antiquity to the present and the various ways in which various African groups are interrelated. Um, and so at any rate, for Dr. Carruthers, I think the study of Kemet was important. And I think the last thing I'll say is this. Kemet represents a type of cultural exemplar. And the reason why this is important to point out is that, of course, Africa, there are myriad of civilizations in Africa. We're talking about Mana Matapa, Ouagadougou, Songhai, Mali,
Mali. Yeah. Hmm.
Oyo,
Hmm.
Ashanti, Congo. There are many, many, many civilizations on the African continent. But one of the things that is distinct about Kemet was its longevity.
Hmm.
Um, it endured for millennia.
The pyramid builders had ancestors.
That's right. They had
You
that's right.
know what I'm
They would
saying?
talk about antiquity. Right.
Right,
They would
right,
talk about the ancients, you know.
right.
And so as a resource or as a culture which is emblematic of the African paradigm, the African worldview, there's simply so much more to study in
Mm,
terms of history, in terms of literature, in terms of um, particularly in terms of literature and the historical scope of Kemet. And so I think for those scholars, they recognize the importance of that. And I think for Carruthers, and you see this in his masterpiece, Medu Neter, Divine Speech, you see the way in which he demonstrates the continuity of thought in ancient Kemet to not only Africans in antiquity, but even in many respects to Africans living in the diaspora today.
Yeah, and to kind of piggyback off of what you were saying as far as Job, I think even that conversation that we have seen about ancient Kemet lately, and uh, you know, the the way we, I'm not going to say we because I don't participate in that, but the way some even speak about Job, it's as if he is all right. We're just that they it lacks the political analysis of what Job was actually attempting to, and well,
Yeah,
not even just what he was doing, right? The
yeah.
man that wrote The Cultural Unity of Black Africa,
Hmm.
or Black Africa, the Economic and Cultural Basis for a
Hmm.
Federal State. This
Hmm.
person, right? He's not,
Right,
it's not just
right.
about history for the sake
But it's not.
of knowing as much history as you can about Africa.
Right.
Like, no, these have political implications,
Exactly.
and I think
Exactly.
that has been removed from the discourse in some
Very much.
circles when it comes to Kemet
Hmm.
and when it comes to
Hmm.
Sheikh Anta Job. And I just wanted to throw that out there because every
Hmm.
time I kind of see those discourses, I'm like, yo, like this is not just an exercise in how much history, Black history can one learn. Like, no,
Right.
this is political. Everything is
Exactly.
political. And Sheikh
Exactly.
Anta Diop understood that more
That's
than
right. That's right.
a lot of scholars in the past. And so that's one thing that I've always found interested in that conversation that that I guess, is arising now. I just feel like it's total way off basis, and
Oh,
doesn't
yeah.
it's not giving us Sheikh Anta Diop, Dr. Theophilo Bang. It's not giving them the
Mm.
credit that
Mm-mm.
they deserve.
No.
Just looking at this from it's like they're looking at it from, again, this adversarial
That's right.
European worldview
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
is Shake and the Joke versus, right?
That's right.
Like,
That's right.
like just I may call Timberland and Swiss Beats, and let's have the history version of it, right? Like that's not what we're doing here.
Yeah.
But when it comes to, but as we, again, worldview is such a important part of this analysis that we're going over as far as what Jacob Carruthers wrote, his idea of worldview and reality
Mm-hmm.
and systems of knowledge. If you can, what was his issues with, like, Hegel, Locke,
Mm-hmm.
Montesquieu,
Hmm.
and if you can, I want you to talk to the people about how the philosophies and ideas of people like Hegel went on to justify
Hmm.
systems of slavery and colonialism throughout the world. Because I think a lot of times people, when they read philosophy, they don't, again, the politics is separated from the philosophy oftentimes,
Hmm.
when these systems these systems of knowledge have played a role in our enslavement and subjugation.
That's right. So I guess let me say I want to say something to the piece you mentioned a moment ago,
Hmm.
just quickly. One of the things that Dr. Ruthers talked about, and I believe this was I think he talks about this in Meta Divine Speech. Unless I'm assuming is that book. If not, I'm remembering a conversation from a class a long, long time ago. But he talked about how one of the elements that was a key part of the intellectual discourse in Greece rather, was that each generation of intellectuals felt that it was necessary for them to outdo their predecessors, right? They had to supplant them and demonstrate that those people that came before them, their predecessors, they were wrong and they
Hmm.
are right. And so there was a very antagonistic, adversarial relationship to the
Hmm.
past, even though these are the people upon whose shoulders they stood. That isn't really the African way. When you look at Kemet, you'll often find texts, whether we're talking about one text, in fact, that's a good example of this, is the Memphite theology,
Hmm.
right? Which Baca talks about. He's attempting to build upon, he's attempting to revitalize and represent an ancient text, right? That he found this text and he is in fact representing this text to the people. Or when you talk about Amenemhat and the Wahemi Masu, right? This idea of the repetition of the birth and how during his reign there was a representation of a number of what for him were ancient texts.
Hmm.
African worldview is one that emphasizes the importance of continuity. Why? Because as Dr. Carruthers writes, the past is the foundation upon which the future is erected. And so rather than see our predecessors in an adversarial light, the idea is to see our predecessors, see ourselves as a continuation of
Mm,
our predecessors who are charged with building upon their good works and
absolutely.
making works to live for eternity. Um, with
We
regard
stand on
to
their shoulders, man.
Exactly,
Hmm.
exactly. So with regards to these African thinkers, indeed, I really appreciate that you asked that question
Hmm.
because I think there's a tendency, and I think part of this is because we live in an anti-intellectual society, right?
Hmm.
Where many people can't be troubled to read a book that they'd really rather get their information from YouTube videos. And I'm not saying like, some YouTube videos aren't edifying. This is a
Yeah.
case in point, right? But
Right, right.
you have, a lot of misinformation, right?
Hmm.
On social media platforms. And so I think that there is an increasingly prominent tendency of people not to understand the intellectual foundations of the world in which they exist. Well,
Yes.
I should say the paradigmatic foundations of the world in which we exist. That is that social systems, especially complex social systems, are based on ideas. In fact, those social systems themselves simply signify the concretization of those ideas, right?
Hmm.
And so when you look at the 18th and 19th century European philosophers, Dr. Carruthers highlights the extent to which these thinkers were concerned about a, providing an intellectual justification for European domination, for European plunder, right? How the degree to which they were responsible for establishing a set of providing a conceptual basis for systems of exploitation. The essay where he really, I mean, he does this, and of course, I think there's one or two chapters in intellectual warfare where he discusses this. My favorite presentation of this is in his essay, Science and Oppression, which I consider a masterpiece.
So I'm glad you mentioned that because I was just about to bring that up. But go ahead, continue.
Masterpiece. It's a masterpiece. And he talks about how for many of these European thinkers, especially during this era of European imperialism, during the era of enslavement, many of these European thinkers, again, they're providing the intellectual rationale.
Hmm.
You and Hegel, of course, is very important in this domain. And if we talk about
Yeah.
history,
Yeah.
because Hegel argued that, in his sweeping history of the world,
Hmm.
comes to Africa and essentially says that Africa has no
It has
history,
no history. Yep.
that is historically unimportant, that Africa exists outside of history. And this is a very powerful statement. Dr. Carruthers, I remember, shared a story once. He had said that I think he was an undergrad, and it was a class some history class. I don't know if it was a world history class. I don't know what the scope was of the history. But at some point, Africa came up, and the professor turned to him. He said, "I'm sorry, young man, Africa has no history."
Mm. Wow.
And fortunately, he was the kind of person where this type of thing did not do.
Yeah.
Uh, but again, this is important. I think he and I think he had been inoculated by black teachers that he had met earlier in his life.
Hmm.
One in particular, I remember him talking about, who went to great lengths to teach about a great man named Toussaint Louverture.
Absolutely.
And
Wow.
so I
Hmm.
think he knew in his self
Hmm.
that this can't be true,
Yeah.
right? This can't
Hmm.
be true. Because if we could produce a man like Toussaint, or better yet, if we can produce people like the people that I saw growing up, you know, dignified, upstanding, intelligent, and capable African people, clearly these people are not historical anomalies, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Clearly, these people are reflective of the temperament and the capability of people which preceded them.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
and, and Hegel, in his attempt to excise Africans out of history, of course, is a very powerful move because, in effect, in engaging in making this claim, it effectively uh, it removes all ethical considerations,
Hmm.
any critique that one might make of the enslavement of African people, or of the colonization, or the colonization of Africa, right? The dispossession of African resources, the massive loss of African life, the destruction of countless African, societies and civilizations in the conquest of both slavery and colonialism. And so Hegel's a historical claim, in many respects, was key in terms of providing a type of justification for this type of barbarity. And so one of the things that Carruthers again was keen to emphasize, he said that one had to study the oppressor. And this is one of the things that was interesting to me when I was a graduate student at Inner City Studies. He really emphasizes that it's not just enough for us to study our own past, but we have to study the oppressor. Why do we have to study the oppressor? Because we have to understand the types of ideas that inform the society in which we exist. I remember, and I don't remember if this is a class with him or a class with Dr. Anderson Thompson, but I remember there was a class and we were reading Machiavelli,
Hmm.
the Prince
Yeah,
by Machiavelli,
I got it
and
somewhere around there.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, and Francis Bacon, I think it was Novum
Hmm.
Organum, and he was keen to emphasize the way in which these texts were demonstrative of a particular view of reality.
Hmm.
Just to give one example of this, right? Uh, One of the things that Francis Bacon emphasized in that text, he delineates a particular type of relationship between humanity and nature, right? That is that nature possesses secrets, and it is the charge of man to take those secrets, essentially to exploit nature. Well, that's the ethos of the Western world, of the industrial world,
Hmm.
right? Ethos which humanity can clearly no longer afford if we look
Right.
at what's happening relative to climate change and resource and species extinction and mounting resource scarcity. And of course, Machiavelli, in his counsel in terms of how to rule, uh, provides really the just an etho. I mean, it was a lesson. It was a discourse in. I
Power
mean, if
and imperialism,
yeah,
right?
power and imperialism, exactly. Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is not, he did not delineate, it was not a saber yet in wise,
Mhm.
governance based on wisdom. And
Mm.
it was the complete opposite of this, really what we find ourselves in today. And this is what I was saying, the ethos of fundamental alienation reproduces or actually or concretizes particular social arrangements based on itself,
Right.
right? And so when we look at, the political culture in the United States or any Western society, we look at the intrigue, we look at the deception, we look at the manipulation, we look at the accumulation of wealth, the resource deprivation, the inhumanity, the privileging of elite interests relative to the interests of the masses. All of these things are things which are reflective of a particular
Hmm.
worldview, actualized in governance. And so for him, you have to study these European thinkers because their ideas are the basis of the world in which we exist. And I think it's unfortunate because many of our people, they eschew this kind of study. And this kind of goes back to something you were saying before. Many of us, due to again a lack of our own cultural center or an awareness of our own cultural center, we accept the European worldview as universal
Yeah.
because they tell us it's universal, and we take their word for it.
Hmm.
But it's not universal, right? There are myriad of ways in which humans have and do make sense of the world. This is why, I'm always intrigued by these various movements of re-indigenization happening all over the world with various indigenous people attempting to reclaim their languages and the cultures and so forth.
Absolutely. Hmm.
Each of these cultures represents a unique way of seeing and being in the world. And so again, one of the things that again is important in terms of understanding these thinkers, we understand how the European way of seeing things, and each of these thinkers articulates in various ways, but it demonstrates the particularity of this particular worldview, not its inevitability, right?
Mm. Right.
That there are other ways in which we can live and exist and be in the world, not simply in one where that or the very organization of the world itself is predicated upon fundamental alienation. That is a system based on an endemic conflict.
And like you mentioned in the book, as far as Bacon and idea of man and nature, not seeing us as human, seeing
That's
us
right.
as a part of nature, being
Right.
able to take whatever it was from us that would sustain their society, their civilization. And like, and you mentioned like this idea of universality. And we look at Hegel and his ideas of universal history, absolute spirit, and these things, right? And I remember I interviewed Dr. Petway about his book that he wrote about Placido and Manzano in Cuba, where he talks about how universality for the most part, always led to our subjugation. Um, because, this obviously we can point back with Portugal and the Pope, right? But even then, like during the time of Placido and Manzano, the example that he used of how this was antithetical to African thought and African ways of knowing was the idea that we we enslaved in Cuba, right?
Hmm.
Uh, you adopt Catholicism, but you still have your African spirituality,
Hmm.
but one is not necessarily canceling out the other.
Right, right.
You see this, all right, this is you're able to compartmentalize,
Hmm.
so to speak, where this is what this is over here. This is what this is over here. Now, I've interviewed brothers and sisters on the continent and or had conversations with them, and they'll say something. Maybe we'll talk about religion or spirituality, and they belong like two or three religions sometimes, right? But it's not. But it's not. But it's.
Right.
It's not a conflict for them
Oh,
because there's not a universal way of seeing things, right? And
right.
whenever there's a universal way of seeing things, the dominant culture, as you mentioned in the book, knowledge is power.
Mhm.
Politically, that is, because the people in power uh, have the ability to tell you what knowledge systems are true,
Right.
right? And so, whenever we're looking at what is considered true, what epistemologies are seen as right and exact, when it comes to universality, obviously the standard is going to be with the people with power.
Right.
And we are always outside of that, right? And so like I just felt like that was a very like whenever I read that, it was just a kind of one of those was like, let me get my notebook out so I can take some more notes. But no, I really appreciated you touching on that because again, even when it comes to these, I guess, these European frameworks, these European philosophies,
Mhm.
again, this is what has shaped the world and shaped reality as we know it, right? Which is Jacob Carruthers' whole point. We need to get out of that and orient ourselves with an African worldview. And so when it comes to, um, I guess, Divine Speech. He wrote a book, Divine Speech, Medu Netter, and uh, I guess the profound expression of Kemetic society and knowledge production and how they, and just the again, like you mentioned, it's we're unable to plan a future for ourselves without
Mhm.
a re-Africanization and a reconceptualization of our history.
Mhm.
But whenever we look at Medu Neter and it's such an ancient civilization, right? And when we look at again, you mentioned alienation. A lot of that, I had a conversation with one of my friends about I don't think used the term alienation in that context, but I think I was referring to the same thing when I just had the thought about how, in a lot of cases, what we consider high civilization, what we consider, technological advancement and Western modernity, oftentimes is antithetical to the frameworks of our or and thought systems and knowledge systems of our ancestors that we would like to bring into the future with us to indeed create our reality. So it feels like a battle, right? Like you look at countries that have their own their that a lot of their culture has been intact, right? Over the years. Obviously there's going to be transculturation with, people and migrations and people leaving out, people coming in. That's always going to occur. But when we see countries that have a big either uh Western presence, whether through its military or extremely or not only military but uh I guess business and corporations, uh you see them beginning to leave their old ways
Right, right.
for what they consider, I guess what we consider advancement. And I just wanted you to, if you can, just speak on that because I always it always makes me, I go into deep thought every time I see somebody promote the idea that technological advancement, modernity, uh, these are the staples of what it means to have a quote unquote high civilization.
Yeah, yeah. There's an African proverb. I think it's a Yoruba proverb, but I can't remember for sure. But it essentially says the person who is being carried, the child, I'm sorry, the child that's being carried on the person's back doesn't know where they're being
Mm,
taken, doesn't know where they're headed. And and unfortunately, I think that um, in being blindly led uh, by the West by Europeans, we have many of us are unwittingly putting ourselves in a position where we don't know where it is that we're going. And what do I mean by this? Um, Again, part of this has to do with the presentation of Europeans of the universality of their worldview.
mhm.
Um, and of course, Europeans, when we look at the process of enslavement and colonialism, this idea is represented to us or has been represented to us on our ancestors in multiple ways. When Africans began to present Christianity to African people, whether on the plantations in the Americas or whether on the African continent, they don't present Christianity to them as a particular way of being in the world. A is a particular religious truth. They present it as the truth, the
Right,
absolute,
right.
right? And we see just the profound efficacy of that process today, where you
Mhm.
have not only where I think Africa today is, Catholicism is spreading more rapidly in Africa than any other continent today. Africa by far is the most, Christian continent in the world. Um, Black people generally tend to be the most religious, particularly,
Yeah.
as
You,
slave.
Dr. Clark said we out Pope the Pope and out
That's
Muhammad
right.
Muhammad, right?
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, yeah. Oh, and I've even heard, and I'm sure you have as well, Black folks say, maybe just misguided Negroes say that
Yeah.
they're thankful for enslavement because
Oh yeah. There was somebody in the news recently that what's the what's Mark Robinson, North Carolina, the guy that's running for office, the brother who had the yeah, he's a trip. He said something like that. Yeah, it's insane. I there's it's definitely something I wanted to ask you.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
I'm glad I remembered. So science and oppression, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
The essay that Dr. Jacob Carruthers wrote. I think it kind of goes in, and I don't want anybody to misconstrue my ideas on technological advancement because I am not anti-science.
Mhm.
I have I study science. I love the natural sciences and understanding about, the world around me and technology. I'm in tech. That's how I make my living, right? So it's like I get that,
Yeah,
but I'm saying losing culture
right,
in the process
right.
is a problem, right? And
Yeah, yeah.
but so what I wanted to ask you though, all right, so when we again, like when we talked about the discourse around Kemet that's happening lately, a lot of what's happening as well is the idea that science alone is going to
Hmm.
liberate us,
That's right.
right?
That's right.
And so what would Dr. Jacob Carruthers say about that idea?
Yeah, for him, he saw, and I think he lays this out very clearly in Science and Oppression. Is you know, he would argue science to what end, right? Because
Hmm.
if the if what Europeans have done, if what Europeans have created, right, and then he lays this out in Science and Oppression, essentially that what he does, he links the process of science to the methodology of science to the European worldview. That is, if one is engaging in the study of nature for the sake of optimizing and facilitating the exploitation of nature, this is what this is a parallel to another process of studying the Negro for the sake of controlling the Negro,
Mm,
right?
mm,
That essentially science is a mechanism or is a tool of control. Um, does this mean that our ancestors did not engage in scientific inquiry? Of course they did. We know that they did.
absolutely.
They studied the
And
state
Kemet.
in Kemet, right?
Right.
Or whether we're talking about civil engineering, or whether we're talking about food production, or whether we're talking about, architecture.
Methodology.
Exactly, exactly. For him, part of the process or part of the challenge, I should say, is that the European enterprise of science is wedded to a process of the exploitation and control of nature.
Mm,
That is that
mm,
his
mm.
impulses are as imperialistic as the desire of the various, anthropologists who would go study, people in Africa and Asia in the 18th and 19th centuries of 19th and 20th centuries for the sake of understanding these people for the sake of optimizing control, optimizing or maximizing control over them. So for him, any study, any development of a scientific enterprise has to be undergirded by an understanding of the worldview of our ancestors.
Mm,
I think that, and he writes about this topic in a number of places, but I'm going to refer to what he talks about in essays in ancient Egyptian studies about Ma'at.
mm,
What this and I'm going to, like I'm saying the word scientific inquiry, and it's interesting because it was a point, it was in one of his essays, and I think in Ancient Intellectual Warfare, where he talked about the language itself,
yeah.
right? And I think at one point in one of the essays, I think he referred to it as the European empirical sciences as a way of de of removing sort of a conceptual weight of the European enterprise from the word science itself. But at any rate, for him, the question I think would be if if we are engaged, if we have a worldview which sees harmony as the basis of the basic nature of reality,
Hmm.
and we see it as our obligations to maximize that in our interrelations with one another, our relations with nature, and so forth. What then does science look like, or what are the ends of
Mm.
science?
Right.
Right? What are the ends of science? This is what's important here. I want to provide the contrasting perspective that I want to come back to this. If we see the universe as one that can be characterized by conflict at every conceivable level, that is endemic conflict, then our orientation towards science, that is our orientation towards inquiry into the natural world, will be predicated upon engaging or positioning humanity or the wielders of this knowledge above the forces of nature. Right? It
Mm.
becomes a
Right.
contestation of power. It becomes about controlling nature, bending nature to the will of humanity, and so forth. Again, returning to the classical African paradigm, if harmony is the basis upon which we see reality, or we say harmony is the basic nature of reality, then our inquiry into the natural world will be concerned about how do we both optimize conditions of living for humanity while also maintaining optimal conditions whereby we can continue to interrelate with nature. Part of the challenge here, and Dr. Mama Marimba Ani writes about this. She says that Europeans have engaged in the desacralization of nature,
Mm.
desacralization of reality.
Hmm.
Uh, I don't think the importance of this can be understated. I remember, when I was in Ghana at a Fulbright some years ago, and I remember reading a thesis, well, when I was there of this young man, and the thesis was about the prospect of developing ecotourism in this one particular region of Ghana where there's this waterfall. One of the things that was very interesting to me is that he highlights in his thesis, or highlighted in his thesis, that one of the challenges with this was the way in which the local people saw this waterfall versus the way that tourists and
Mm.
people in the Ministry of Tourism would see the waterfall. He said these are contrasting perspectives.
Hmm.
For local people for whom this waterfall was associated with their spiritual traditions, for whom that waterfall itself may represent a type of force, right?
Right.
They see this as a sacred thing. This is not something which is appropriate as a type of spectacle. This is
Mm.
not something that is appropriate for people to just visit to take pictures of.
Right. Right.
But this is something. This is a shrine to the ancestors. This is a shrine to the divine, to nature as a divinity, to nature as divine.
Hmm.
Or this is a something which signifies our interrelation, our interconnection with the land itself, a place from which we derive nourishment, inspiration, medicine, and so forth. and that this is a different worldview than someone in some ministry somewhere, like the Ministry of Tourism, and they just want to monetize this for the sake of making money. Well, part of the uh, part of the challenge with what Mama Marimba points out, the desacralization of nature, if we take away from nature its sacred quality, then nature becomes something which is easily exploited. And so
Hmm.
again, the question becomes, how do people who see nature as sacred engage in, Europeans would call it naturalistic or inquiry into the study of the natural world? Well, again, they build social systems, but they're social systems that attempt to maintain harmony, maintain equilibrium. I think it's interesting to point out, right? I mean, many people, and this is kind of going back to what you had asked previously, people uphold Western modernity as a standard for civilization or
Yeah.
standard for this thing called development.
Hmm.
The problem is this: the Industrial Revolution starts in roughly the middle of the 18th century.
Hmm.
And in the span of less than 300
It's
years,
destroyed the planet.
in the span of less than 300 years,
Yeah, man.
and
Mm,
all of
mm,
us,
mm,
whether, we're talking about our ancestors in Africa,
mhm.
whether we're talking about Native American civilizations in the Americas, you know, I mean, not, whether we're talking about, maybe not all civilizations, obviously, there was some civilizations which were more destructive than others, and I can name some examples, but the point is that many of our ancestors created civilizations which lasted for centuries and or millennia.
Yes.
How were they able to do this? They were able to do this because they developed a means of living in concert with nature.
Hmm.
Uh, the exploitative and acquisitive ethos of Europeans has negated that. When I say acquisitive, I mean the a orientation towards the world which sees the accumulation of material wealth, of material resources as the primary consideration.
Hmm.
Uh, and so again, for him, I would argue that science or anything which purports to be a scientific enterprise has to, as its fundamental basis, be concerned about Ma'at, or and whatever and however that's articulated.
Right.
And because various African cultures will articulate this in different ways, or various African peoples would attempt to articulate this in different ways. So I'll give one last example.
Hmm.
So again, because I don't want people to get the impression that, oh, we're just talking about something that Black people were talking about like thousands and thousands of years ago. No, we can talk about Carter G. Woodson.
Right.
Not Carter G. Woodson, I'm sorry, George Washington Carver.
Oh, as far as science, yeah.
I mean, here you have the perfect example of a person who is engaged in science, but approach science from vantage point of the sacredness of nature.
He
Right.
he approached it like he practiced hoodoo,
Right.
you know?
Exactly. Talking to plants.
Right, right.
Talking to
Talking to
plants.
plants. I'm
The
like,
spirit in the
wow,
plants.
that is
Is there
so
a spirit in
African,
the
man.
plant?
Right.
Yeah. And even, I mean, some of the innovations he developed around agriculture,
Hmm.
and of how you maintain productivity in the land. I mean, these were practices that our ancestors were engaged in West Africa. This
Mm.
is what science looks like from an African worldview, because it's an orientation towards inquiry, uh, predicated upon both optimizing human well-being, but also maintaining harmony with nature. And you find today, many people in the West attempting to develop, these types of perspectives and these types of practices. But for
Hmm.
us, it's part of our ancestral inheritance. And the problem is that for many of us, because we've embraced again the European way as universal, we look down upon the ways of our ancestors without understanding the wisdom of the ways of our ancestors, and that these practices enabled for them to sustain themselves for centuries, if not millennia, in their respective societies.
And words like primitive
Exactly.
are used as weapons against um, you know, indigenous ways of life all throughout the world.
Right.
And uh, like even in like the Amazon rainforest, where there are it's interesting. They call them they say that they're uncontacted tribes, but many of them had been contacted. They didn't like the interaction that they had with Europeans, and they went back in the
Right.
rainforest, right? But obviously, being in there, they and being masters of where they live, and they are living in harmony with nature. They know obviously the medicinal
Yeah.
aspects of everything that's around them, right? I've heard stories and read stories about Westerners going out there and having to be evac'd out, and one of the but later on to only find that indigenous people, they'll go get something from a tree, boil it, add this and this, and you're good in 2 days, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
then when pharmaceutical companies get wind of
that's right.
this, they're coming, they're chopping down trees,
Everything.
they're
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, and it just goes to show again, like you said, this idea of man versus nature and us taking from nature and not giving anything back. Um, Dr. Rashid, like always, I've always appreciate these conversations. I really appreciate this book. I really appreciate how you lay out uh Carruthers' ideas of about worldview, about uh, African-centered education, about why it's important to understand a lot of these European philosophies, frameworks, and epistemologies, because they do shape the reality that we live in, and they are also used to justify a lot of the atrocities that have been placed against us. And so, again, this book is very important, and I just wanted to thank you again for writing this. If I know it's on Amazon, but do you prefer if is there another way that you prefer people to get the book, or does it matter?
No, they can get it on Amazon. They can get it from Lexington Books,
Mhm.
Roman. Either one is fine. Yeah, but definitely, I definitely appreciate it. If I could say one more thing,
Absolutely.
uh, there's a chapter in the book. I think it's chapter 10, which deals with the Haitian Revolution. I just wanted to say this
Oh yeah,
really.
and I did want to ask you. Matter of fact,
Yeah,
I did want to ask you about that because the way, obviously a lot of our introduction to the Haitian Revolution was through Black Jacobins and CLR
yeah,
James. But what Jacob Carruthers does with Irritated Genie is not just look at it from a historical framework, but look at it how these things can affect our movements in now in
that's right.
real
That's right.
time. So if
Yeah,
you can just like, but what were
yeah.
you going to say?
No, no, yeah, yeah. I mean, first of all, yeah, I definitely agree. His book, Irritated Genie, is a very critical and vital analysis of the Haitian revolutionary struggle. In it, he advances many of the arguments that I've made, just in this conversation
Hmm.
about the importance of our paradigms. He illustrates how African paradigms were a basis for not only a basis for resistance itself, that is, that it provided the conceptual impetus for resistance, that is, the motivation for resistance, but that also African paradigms informed the methodology, the
Right.
methods of resistance
But
themselves.
but Dr. Rashid, isn't it funny how you often see people who are materialist and they'll say, how did voodoo, what did that have anything to do with the Haitian Revolution? Whether you don't believe in any of the, religious aspects of it, just to reorienting themselves
Right.
with Africa, that's, you know what I mean? Like that was
Right.
enough.
Right. Yeah. Right. Again, and so it's interesting you say that because so we had it real quick. We had an Africa
Mm,
Forum last year. We looked at a film that looked at Africa Haitian migrants in Western DR, Western Dominican
mhm.
Republic. And one of the discussants, he raised a very interesting point. It's fascinating. He argued that many of the ills which afflict Haitian people could, if they could throw off the yoke, of course, of neocolonialism in terms of the types of social institutions which could provide the greatest impetus towards the regeneration of Haitian society, was the ethics of Vodun
Mm,
and the Laku system. The Laku system is a system of cooperative land management and agriculture and community, which again provides the essence, both the ethos as well as the methods whereby community can be enacted as a type of social value. But Vodou also is an anchoring that mechanism to anchor people towards a particular conception of nature, a particular conception of their interrelationship with one another. As well as a sense of purpose, right? I mean, this is, but so yeah, our those traditions, they shape our mind, but they also inform our practices.
mm,
When Boukman performs that and Cecily Fatiman participate in that ritual in August of 1791, this invigorates,
yes.
those would be those revolutionaries to take up arms against this oppressive system. Again,
Yes.
this is why Amilcar Cabral said that you cannot that I'll show you the readiness of a people to engage revolutionary struggle by the degree to which their culture is dissimilar from that of their oppressor. And I'm paraphrasing
Mm,
because he knew if you think the same way as your enemy, you're not going to fight against your enemy. That's why there are many people in our community today. They don't want to extricate us from the oppressive system. They don't want to extricate us from the oppressive system. They want, as I say in the book, they want to reconcile themselves with that system. They want to assimilate within that system. They want the rewards of European domination rather
hmm
than the reward of African freedom because they have accepted the worldview of their enemy. One of the things that, and the only reason why I mentioned that chapter as well as the Haitian Revolution is just because one of the points one of the things that I attempt to do in chapter 10 of the book is I attempt to take what Dr. Carruthers says in The Irritated Genie and also to extend it even further into the present and to draw some parallels with contemporary movements. And one of the things that I dwell on is the same parallel that he drew and he talks about in his book, The Irritated Genie versus the Phantom of Liberty. And one of the things that the irritated genie, for those that don't know, is the spirit of revolution. It's the spirit
hmm
of African revolution, the unwavering, uncompromising spirit of Black revolution. The Phantom of Liberty is the promise that the French held out to Africans, to the Blacks of Haiti, the promise of liberty, the promise of brotherhood, the promise of equality. But it was a half-hearted promise. It was a promise which would never be fulfilled. And one of the things that Dr. Carruthers highlights is that the Phantom of Liberty is
hmm
constantly paraded before African people.
Well,
Uh,
it's election time, and we see it
it's a
now.
lesson time. We see it right now. This is why I was thinking about it, right?
Yeah.
Because you have many of our people for whom the striving or the pursuit, the incessant pursuit of the Phantom of Liberty has become the totality of their political vision,
Yes.
the totality of their conception of our future as a people, predicated upon us engaging in an endless game of chasing after that phantom. And it's a reason why he called it, why Dessalines, book is Jean-Jacques Dessalines, why he called it the Phantom of Liberty, because it was something which would never be actualized in the world. And so African people are supposed to accept that
hmm
the alternative that is a myth of the possibility of equality within the European system versus the surety of a future which we create for ourselves.
mm
And election time always becomes an important reminder of the degree to which many of our minds have been impoverished by virtue of this idea, where the phantom of liberty represents the only possibility, the only thing which is tangible, which we might pursue. And I think one of the things which I'm very much appreciative, not only of Dr. Brothers, but also of our ancestors, is that they argued there was another way, that there was
Yeah.
a different.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's imperative that we continue to have these conversations because that we are able to, have great works like these. Cut again, when we look at we talked about Martin Delaney and his idea of a nation within a nation, and we see how over time, the ideas of Black nationalism have evolved. And we see the different theories that we have come up with using our own frameworks.
Mhm.
And again, it's not about what are the solutions per se. It's the solutions are there. You have to, it, it's going to require you to pick up a book and read. It just is, you know what I mean? I'm sorry, it is, however much you want to get around it and circumvent that aspect, we just can't do, we can't because again, as Dr. Carruthers talked about, as Du Bois uh, talked about, even Fanon talked about, a lot of our realities are shaped by the thoughts of these European philosophers and thinkers, and so we have to understand theirs. We have to orient ourselves with our own African worldview, like you so eloquently pointed out in this book. So again, I appreciate you, Dr. Rashid. This has been a dope conversation.
For sure. Thank you. Always appreciate these conversations. I look forward to other folks engaging with the book and engaging with the community about the book. Again, for me, what I'm attempting to do, just like Dr. Carruthers attempt to do, is to bring forth the ideas of our ancestors to
Mhm.
our so they can inform our future. So I'm definitely desire hopeful and or I should say appreciative to be in this stream of African deep thought. So Asante Sana to you, good brother.
Absolutely. And peace and blessings, my brother. I appreciate it again. The conversation was dope. Y'all go out and buy the book. The link is in the description. Buy two and give one away. But again, thank you again, brother.
Thank you. Thank you.
Peace.